ReferendumFest. Today's speaker is Lesley Riddoch, broadcaster, journalist, PhD student, and the author of Blossom, What Scotland Needs to Flourish. Lesley's going to speak for however long, 10-15 minutes, perhaps longer, perhaps less, and then open it up to the floor. We have to finish at 4:45 on the dot. There will be time for book signing and so on afterwards. So over to Lesley.
Well, thanks very much, everybody. I was going to stand, and then I thought, do you know, I'm knackered. Do you mind if I sort of sit? No, you do mind, do you?
No, right.
I quickly identified the hecklers there for a minute. No, that's going to be a difficult job. It's hard to kind of condense all of a book into 10 minutes, but since other people do, I should try and give this one a shorty. Could I just ask, out of my interest, how many people have read the book? It's not like, you know, it's not necessary, but it's just so I'm not telling you all stuff you already know. Thanks. Well, the purpose really of writing the book is called Blossom, What Scotland Needs to Flourish. It doesn't have the word referendum in it, except in the first page, where it says that whatever the vote is in the referendum, Scotland will need something more to transform itself. And actually, I think practically everybody on either side of the debate could agree that that's true. I mean, intuitively, you know in a way that when, you know, if you leave a job, if you leave a country, if you leave a city, if you leave a partner, you don't suddenly magically change overnight. You take a lot of baggage with you, actually, wherever you go in life. And there are some very deep-seated dynamics in Scottish society that will need more than simply voting for independence, although I'm certainly planning to do it. But we'll need more than that to be able to kind of let Scotland flourish. And the book's trying to look, well, I suppose it arose out of a long-term inability by myself to be able to square some things about Scotland. I mean, on the one hand, it's a stunningly beautiful country. I think we'd all agree. I mean, especially the more you travel, the more you realise it truly is. It's stunningly beautiful and very diverse. The more you travel, the more you realise as well how many other countries don't have even a fraction of the natural resources that Scotland has. And I don't just mean the old stuff, the coal, the oil and the gas, although we have an embarrassment of riches of all of those. But equally, renewable resources, I mean, it's often said Scotland is the Saudi Arabia of alternative energy supplies, and perhaps that's been said so often that it just seems stale. It's not, it's true. It's stunningly true. So all of this is sitting in this little country, and you sort of think that, that the people who would live in such a country, such a beautiful, diverse, energy-rich, natural resources-rich country, would be healthy, wealthy and wise. Are we? I mean, on the health front, I don't really need to ram it all home here. Any of you who are Scots will know that we ain't doing just so well. Some of our health outcomes, particularly in the deprived areas of our cities, are sub-East European. We have life expectancies amongst women in areas of Glasgow that is now 48 or 50 years old. That's gone completely in the opposite direction. That's not progress. We as a nation scored F recently for fitness in a European League table. And that's not that newfangled kind of F that our Wanes have, you know, when we're F is good at school. That's the old F, you know, that's the bad F. We're right at the bottom there. So on the health front, we're not doing very well. On the wealth front, well, obviously, some people have got a lot of money here. Actually, Aberdeenshire, I understand, has the highest proportion of multi-millionaires in Britain, and that's including London and the South East. So there's some people with a lot of money, and we know perfectly well poverty has increased fourfold in the last 10 years. We're a deeply unequal society. And when I was kind of thinking about all of this, I was thinking, how does this all hang together? How do we have all this sort of potential in a way, and how do we seem to keep quite not realising it? And it struck me as well, how would you actually say, what would you say was a success for Scotland? What would you say we were aiming at all? If you look at the way that Scots have been voting for the last 80 years, pretty well longer since the formation of the Labour Party, Scots at every general election have been voting 40% or more Labour since way back then. Now, that's a long track record for voting for the nearest party that there has been, until very recently, that you could say was supporting the creation of social democracy. We have been voting at more than 40% for about 90 years for a party that wants a social democracy. Now that is radically different from the rest of the UK. We know that the Scots voted out every single Conservative MP in 1997. We should have got a prize for that, by the way, you know, because that was, I mean, nobody stood with a clipboard or anything. That was just a piece of spontaneous, in the ether stuffing, you know, which is kind of impressive. But it's longer than that, this desire to have something different, something that isn't a market-driven, top-down, elitist, devil-take-the-hindmost kind of society. We want something more than that. It's studied all the way through our literature. A man's a man for all that, we're all Jock Tamson's bairns. But the tragedy of Scotland is that the structures of our governance, the structures of our world, don't reflect those aspirations at all. Not at all. And in this respect, you'd have to say that Scotland is actually weird. Now, I know this is a kind of hard one to get your heads around, because wherever you've grown up, you think it's normal. That's normal. I grew up in Northern Ireland, as you'll hear from my accent, and it was normal to have bombs going off all night. So, you know, you'll grow used to whatever is normal. So I could say to you, and regularly do to people, that for example, the first weird about Scotland is that we have land is in the most concentrated, small number of hands in Scotland than practically anywhere else in the world, the developed world. Now that's weird. 16 people in Scotland own 10% of the land. Now, you know, this, as in many meetings when I've mentioned this before, not a flicker has gone through any face in the audience. That's the second weird. We have accepted this extraordinary state of affairs and nobody bats an eyelid. Now it could be that you're sitting there saying, tell me something I don't know, honey. You could know all this and just, you don't need, but you know, and of course we're Scots, so we actually excel in the poker face and we didn't show emotions and all that. Come on. You know, we're describing here something which is absolutely distortingly weird, and we've all got so used to it. I could have said to you that one person owns 90% of Scotland. Would anybody have batted an eyelid then? Because actually, who knows? Who has a direct connection enough with any of this stuff to have a good feeling for how many people own this blinking country? There was one meeting I held that I was talking to people and mentioned that statistic, and there was a Nigerian woman in the front row, and she said, "What?" And it was as if it snapped everybody out of their dwam. People went, "Yeah, right enough, what?" But that's half the problem. We've got so used to this as normal that nobody's even reacting particularly. I mean, another weird is our so-called local democracy. Now, it ain't local. We have the largest local councils in Europe. The average, well, the median, let's say, because that's sometimes a better way, it knocks out extremes that gives you a better sense of size. The median council in Germany, which is, let's face it, probably the most powerful economy in Europe, the median size of a council that does most of the same thing as our council is 8,000 people. The median size in Scotland is 115,000 people. Now that's a heck of a difference. The average physical size of a council in Germany is 15 square kilometres. And that would mean that most of the wee towns, which actually most of us live in, most Scots do not live in Edinburgh and Glasgow. We live in wee, knackered, powerless towns. Right, so most wee towns, whether it was the places I've been lately, Stewarton, Helmsdale, Burnham, Dunkeld, these kind of size of places would run themselves. Islands like Barra would run themselves. That's normal. In social democracies, that's normal. What we've got, where we've got one strategic super authority like the Highlands and Islands, that is only normal in other places as a strategic tier of government. That's not where the delivery happens. That's not where it's all happened. That's not where it's at, basically. Let me finish though. That's physical statistic actually, because that's stunning too. 15 square kilometres. That's the average size of a council in Germany. 990 square kilometres. That's Scotland. And if you're thinking, well, okay, Scotland's got more remote bits than Germany, actually Norway and Sweden also have far smaller municipalities by physical size than us, and they are humongous. So there's a wee theme which I developed sort of in the book in all sorts of ways, which is really that we have got used to a top-down, supersized, remote kind of democracy where people making decisions are never in the room. It's never you. It's always somebody from somewhere else. And that would be true whether it's who owns the land, it's always someone you don't meet. Whether it's who runs the council, it's somebody you don't meet. There's a theme in all of this. Whether it's even you go and try and fish in a river, you'll suddenly meet water bailiffs faster than you can say fly, you know, because those two are aspects of our natural resource we can't use. So all of this, it strikes me, is what we need to change. Because if we're trying to aim for something that's kind of a normal social democracy, we also need, I think, to look more to where we're trying to go. It strikes me at the moment, people are tremendously obsessed with England. So, for example, success to most people means doing a couple of percentage points better than England at things. So let's take, for example, local government elections. The last elections in Scotland, the turnout was about 38%, which is rubbish. But the turnout in England was 30%, resulta mundo. Now, as long as that's the way we think, and let's be honest, sometimes we do, we're all stuffed. Because the average turnout in Europe for local elections is 70%, and in the Nordics is 80% without compulsion. Because when you have smaller, powerful municipalities that involve people, actually, funnily enough, people turn out and vote. The same way that 70 to 80% of Scots will turn out and vote in this referendum. Why? Because just for once, we will actually get a result that cannot be mediated by a lot of politicians. This time, we have a lot of power. So, if you were living in somewhere like Sweden, for example, you would not pay any taxes to central government, to Stockholm, unless you earned more than £35,000 a year. Everybody below that level pays all their tax to their local municipality, of about 9,000 people, max. Now that is more normal than we are. What we do, I mean, if you say that to Swedes, the first time I heard that one, I thought, that's pretty weird. And they said, no, you're pretty weird. And that's when I began to think about this differently. It is weird. Why do we do this? We take all our tax and send it away off to Westminster, and then they grudgingly, you know, send a little bit back to Scotland, and then Scotland sends a little bit back to the councils. And let's not even mention community councils. Do you know what the average budget of a community council in Scotland is? It's £400 a year. And it has to be spent on stationery. You are having a laugh. So, you know, in Europe, the English community tier has been deemed recently to be the weakest of all community levels of governance in Europe. And their town and parish councils have a budget of around £750,000 a year. We have £400. Now, does that match with the communitarian idea the Scots have of ourselves? Does that match with a man's a man for all that and all that kind of stuff? No, it doesn't. But again, we don't even seem to notice that because we didn't travel around enough. And when we do, we're on holiday. I think we need to start looking around us as to what effectively is normal for where we're trying to go. And the last thing I want to say is this, which is, anybody ski in the audience? Anybody ski? Right, skiers always sit in front, good. And 1.5, 2. Well, I still can't ski, but I have two stepdaughters who are very keen to learn. So we went to France. The French technique is to just throw people down a hill, but generally speaking, they've listened to how to stop first, which I didn't. So I was hurtling down this hill and didn't really know how to do the snowplow to stop. And there was a wee lassie at the bottom of the hill. And I was just hurtling towards her. And I thought, oh God, you know, and so I tried a few moves to sort of avoid her, but I had no moves because I couldn't ski, so I was still going straight towards her. And just before I hit her, I kind of cowered to one side, knocked my head, got no sympathy. But later, one of my stepdaughters, Rosie, came up and said, did you not hear what the instructor said? And I said, well, evidently not, you know, the irresponsible adult. And she said, what he said was that you just need to look where you want to go, and your skis will follow. Where were you looking? At the wee lassie. And at this moment I thought, you know, this is actually a life lesson, this moment, because that's what happens. You know, the more you stare at something to avoid it, the more you actually end up heading straight towards it. And if we were to sort of take this in a larger sense, and believe me, I have nothing, I'm not anti-English. I was born in Wolverhampton. My husband is an Englishman. I went to university in England, worked in England. But I am very anti the elitism of what Westminster has become. Now, if we're not trying to aim for that, then stop looking at it. What we have to try to do is to look where we want to go. In the same way as what I needed to do to avoid that lassie was counterintuitive, although she was worrying me, I had to look where I wanted to go, into space. So that's why, to me, a lot of my efforts have been to try to look again at some of the small successful nations beside us, because that might be the direction that we want to go in. I'm not saying we'd ever become Norway or any other country. No country becomes another country. We're Scotland. But what is it to be Scottish? There are lots of different strands in that weave, and some of them have been overlain more recently by, if you like, a particular outlook that we might decide to unpick. We might decide that we want to go in the direction we've been voting for 90 years. We've been voting to become a social democracy in all the name. And if that's true, then we need to know what's normal for a social democracy. And here's the news, you already know it. You do not end up with 16 people owning all the land. You do not end up with all your rivers unavailable for local people and time-shared into the next century. You do not end up with massive so-called local government so disconnecting that people feel completely powerless in the place they live. You do not have cropped little towns with masses of energy in it and people wanting to try and resuscitate them, but with no formal way to be able to say diddly squat to anybody. You don't have those things. You also don't have early years childcare having no political priority whatsoever. You've sorted it. All of these things are the kind of things that social democracies get right. And finally, you don't have a top-down elitist society, because it doesn't do anyone any good. If you were to look at a sociologist, a Dutch sociologist, Geert Hofstede, and there's plenty about him in here, he did a sort of analysis of 72 countries, and he was able to compare them in lots of different ways. To cut it all down to the point, he had masculine and feminine countries. Now that might sound barking. He didn't mean feminine countries were run by women, sadly. He was meaning these as kind of baskets of characteristics. So masculine countries, he thinks, are competitive, top-down, devil take the hindmost, elitist. They can be quite innovative, and they're always in the headlines. That might remind you somewhere. A feminine country tends to be cooperative, consensual. It can sometimes lack innovative spark, and it tends to just get on with stuff, and it isn't basically running around the world making headlines all the time. And if you took those two characteristics, you'd find that the most feminine country by that token is Sweden, the second most is Norway, third is the Netherlands, fourth is Denmark, and it goes right down through the Nordics and the small countries. And on that league table, the United Kingdom is number 62, which is quite masculine. It's quite competitive. It's about as elitist as you can get, and it's about as top-down as it comes. Now, just to give you an example of how that might work, we are we not, a sporting nation, people, suddenly, because we have won how many Commonwealth Games medals? At the same time, half of us can't run for the bus. Now, those two things are true at the same time. The question is, which matters more? And to a masculine society, and I'm sorry guys away for sort of using your gender to be kind of describing something that's quite as much a crop of what's it as this, but a masculine society would basically be very interested in the Commonwealth Games medals, because the theory then is elites, they always save the day. What you do is you pour money, you pour energy, you pour status and everything into the people who are already at the top. And the thinking then is that if they do really well, we'll all suddenly rise from our couches, won't we people, get on our bikes and race round and round and round really fast in ways that we don't actually do. I mean, that trickle-down theory of income, of the economy, and of sporting prowess doesn't work. I mean, I think everybody can get that. But we believe in it. Britain believes in that. They believe that if you get a small elite of people, they will basically save the day, and nothing must stand in the way of that small elite exerting power however they see fit. A feminine country looks at it quite differently. They're interested in where the average is. They're not worried about where the elite is principally, they're worried about the average. So they would be far more worried about the fact half of us can't run for the bus. They would put that as their top priority, and they would assume that the elite will rise and fall as the average rises and falls. In fact, they would assume that the elite just tends to get up and moves anyway. And let's face it, most of these countries I've mentioned are no slouches in their own winter sports. It's not as if they don't do extremely well at things, but they also have a fit nation. They don't have the extreme that we have in everything, where we have Chris Hoy and people who have, who have difficulty even mounting a bicycle, never mind getting around a course hyper fast. So where do you want to go? If it's okay to think that we can still have this model of society that we keep shoveling up power and everything to a bunch of people at the top, we have a top-down governance, and it doesn't really matter how many people have any skin in the game in this country, then rock on, because that's how we live. We live that way in Scotland and in Britain, because Britishness is infused into all our systems, all our political parties, including the SNP, maybe not the Greens, but it's a very, very British phenomenon that we need to consciously unpick. We've lived like this for centuries. We don't know what it is to even think really of a social democracy. We have not lived in one. So to try to think differently, to try to think that we might live cooperatively, that we might come to more consensual agreements, Scotland's beginning to inch its way that way. We've accepted proportional representation quicker than the rest of the UK. That's not saying much. The Nordics have had it for a century. And that's the kind of societies that you're seeing now are the products of consensus over a much longer period than we could even dream about. But which way do you want to go? To me, that is how I look at the referendum options, really, because there's one offer which is very much predicated on a status quo. And to me, the status quo is a deeply top-down way of working, which isn't really in the best interest of anybody, actually, but doesn't seem to be particularly bothersome to people down south, not the way they vote. In Scotland, we've not wanted that for a very long time. So I think now's the time to sort of realise that and vote the way you want to go. In fact, more than that, look the way you want to go, because we need to build a society that is consistent with our aspirations. Thank you.